Question 1. Operational review demonstrates that a paralegal working on a sensitive litigation matter has overheard a conversation between the client and a third party, not involved in the case, which suggests the client intends to commit a future illegal act that could cause significant physical harm to another individual. The paralegal is aware of the client's intent and the potential for imminent danger. What is the most appropriate immediate course of action for the paralegal? Option A. Advise the client that their conversation has been overheard and that the paralegal is obligated to report their intentions to prevent harm. Option B. Directly contact the intended victim to warn them of the potential danger without informing the supervising attorney. Option C. Immediately consult with the supervising attorney, presenting all known facts regarding the overheard conversation and the potential for harm, to seek guidance on how to proceed. Option D. Disregard the overheard conversation, as all communications related to the client's case are protected by absolute attorney-client privilege. The correct answer is C. Immediately consult with the supervising attorney, presenting all known facts regarding the overheard conversation and the potential for harm, to seek guidance on how to proceed. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a paralegal to navigate the delicate balance between their duty of confidentiality and the potential need to disclose information that could prevent harm. The attorney-client privilege is a cornerstone of legal representation, designed to encourage open and honest communication between clients and their attorneys. However, this privilege is not absolute and has well-defined exceptions. A paralegal's role in identifying and appropriately responding to situations that might trigger these exceptions is critical to upholding both ethical obligations and legal requirements. The core of the challenge lies in accurately assessing the nature of the information and the imminence of the threat, without overstepping the boundaries of their professional responsibilities or breaching client confidentiality unnecessarily. The correct approach involves a thorough understanding of the exceptions to attorney-client privilege as defined by the NFPA ethical guidelines and relevant state bar rules, which are implicitly incorporated into the CRP examination framework. Specifically, the exception for preventing future crimes or serious harm is paramount. This approach requires the paralegal to first confirm the nature of the threat, its severity, and its imminence. If these elements are present, the paralegal must then consult with the supervising attorney immediately, presenting the facts clearly and seeking guidance on the appropriate course of action, which may include disclosure to prevent the harm. This upholds the privilege by only considering disclosure when legally and ethically permissible, and always under the attorney's direction. An incorrect approach would be to ignore the information, believing that all communications are protected by absolute confidentiality. This fails to recognize the established exceptions to attorney-client privilege, particularly those designed to prevent significant harm. Such inaction could have severe ethical and legal consequences, potentially exposing the paralegal and the firm to liability if harm occurs and could have been prevented. Another incorrect approach would be to unilaterally decide to disclose the information to a third party without consulting the supervising attorney. This constitutes a breach of confidentiality and a violation of the attorney-client privilege, as the paralegal lacks the authority to make such a determination or to waive the privilege. Disclosure must be authorized by the attorney, and only when specific exceptions clearly apply. A third incorrect approach would be to discuss the sensitive information with colleagues outside of the legal team or with the client's family without the client's express consent and the attorney's direction. This also violates confidentiality and could prejudice the client's case or create unnecessary distress. The professional decision-making process in such situations should involve a systematic evaluation. 1. Identify the core ethical duty, confidentiality, and attorney-client privilege. 2. Recognize potential exceptions. Understand the established limits to these duties, such as preventing future harm. 3. Assess the facts. Gather all relevant information regarding the potential threat, its severity, and its imminence. 4. Consult the supervisor. Immediately bring the situation to the attention of the supervising attorney, providing a clear and objective summary of the facts. 5. Follow attorney's guidance. Act only as directed by the attorney, ensuring any disclosure is within the bounds of the law and ethical rules. 6. Document actions. Maintain a clear record of the information received, the consultation with the attorney, and the subsequent actions taken. Question 2. The efficiency study reveals that paralegal time spent responding to inquiries from former clients' new counsel regarding past case details is a significant drain on resources. A paralegal receives a call from an attorney representing a former client in a new, unrelated matter. This new attorney requests specific details about the strategy and evidence used in the former client's concluded case, stating it would expedite their current representation. The paralegal has extensive knowledge of the prior case. What is the most ethically appropriate course of action for the paralegal? Option A. Forward the new attorney's request to the former client directly, asking them to authorize the release of information. Option B. Provide the new attorney with a summary of the strategy and key evidence from the prior case, explaining that this will help them understand the context for their current representation. Option C. Offer the new attorney advice on how to approach their current case, drawing parallels to the paralegal's understanding of the former client's situation. Option D. Inform the new attorney that such information is confidential and cannot be shared without the former client's explicit written consent, and then immediately consult with the supervising attorney about the request. Correct answer is D. Inform the new attorney that such information is confidential and cannot be shared without the former client's explicit written consent, and then immediately consult with the supervising attorney about the request. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge rooted in the paralegal's dual responsibility to support the attorney effectively and to uphold the strict ethical obligations governing the attorney-client relationship. The core of the challenge lies in navigating the delicate balance between client confidentiality, the attorney's duty of loyalty, and the paralegal's role in preventing the unauthorized practice of law. The paralegal must recognize that, while efficiency is a laudable goal, it cannot come at the expense of ethical compliance. The correct approach involves the paralegal recognizing the potential conflict of interest and the breach of confidentiality that could arise from sharing information with a former client's new counsel without explicit authorization. This approach upholds the fundamental principles of attorney-client privilege and client confidentiality, which are paramount in legal ethics. Specifically, Rule 1(6) of the ABA Model Rules of Professional Conduct, which serves as the foundation for many state bar rules, and is thus relevant to the NFPA CRP exam's focus on U.S. legal ethics mandates, that a lawyer shall not reveal information relating to the representation of a client, unless the client gives informed consent. The disclosure is implicitly authorized to carry out the representation, or the disclosure is permitted by paragraph B. A paralegal, acting as an agent of the attorney, is bound by these same principles. Sharing information with a former client's new counsel without proper authorization would violate this rule and potentially waive attorney-client privilege. Furthermore, providing substantive legal advice, even if based on past experience, could constitute the unauthorized practice of law, a violation of Rule 5(5) of the ABA Model Rules. An incorrect approach would be to immediately provide the requested information to the former client's new counsel. This action directly violates the duty of confidentiality and attorney-client privilege. The information shared, even if seemingly innocuous, could be strategically advantageous to the new counsel and detrimental to the original client's interests, thereby breaching the attorney's duty of loyalty. Another incorrect approach would be to offer the new counsel substantive advice based on the paralegal's knowledge of the prior case. This constitutes the unauthorized practice of law, as paralegals are not licensed to provide legal advice. They can only relay information or perform tasks delegated by an attorney. A third incorrect approach would be to ignore the request entirely. While this avoids direct ethical violations, it is professionally irresponsible and fails to address the situation proactively, potentially leading to misunderstandings or further complications. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should begin with identifying the ethical implications. Paralegal must ask, does this request involve confidential information? Could fulfilling this request create a conflict of interest? Am I being asked to provide legal advice? If the answer to any of these questions is yes, the paralegal must then consult with the supervising attorney. The attorney is ultimately responsible for ethical compliance and must make the determination on how to proceed, whether it involves obtaining client consent, declining the request, or providing a limited, authorized response. This process ensures that all actions taken are within the bounds of legal ethics and professional responsibility. Question 3. Governance review demonstrates that a paralegal has been tasked with researching case law to support a motion to dismiss a federal lawsuit filed in the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York. The paralegal has identified 3 cases. 1. A decision from the U.S. Supreme Court. 2. A decision from the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. And 3. A decision from the California Supreme Court. The paralegal is preparing a memorandum for the supervising attorney outlining the relevant legal authority. Which of the following approaches best reflects the paralegal's understanding of precedent and case law analysis for this specific task? Option A. The paralegal treats all 3 cases as equally authoritative because they are all decisions from high courts and therefore all have significant persuasive value. Option B. The paralegal focuses solely on the California Supreme Court decision, assuming that a state Supreme Court's ruling on a matter of law is always binding on federal district courts. Option C. The paralegal prioritizes the U.S. Supreme Court decision as binding authority, then analyzes the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit decision as binding authority within its circuit, and finally considers the California Supreme Court decision as persuasive authority due to its origin in a different state's highest court. Option D. The paralegal summarizes the factual background of each case without delving into the specific legal rules or holdings, as the attorney will ultimately interpret the relevance of the facts. Correct answer is C. The paralegal prioritizes the U.S. Supreme Court decision as binding authority, then analyzes the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit decision as binding authority within its circuit, and finally considers the California Supreme Court decision as persuasive authority due to its origin in a different state's highest court. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a paralegal to synthesize information from multiple sources, critically evaluate the relevance and weight of legal authority, and apply that understanding to a specific factual context. The core of the challenge lies in accurately identifying and applying precedent, which is fundamental to legal reasoning and practice under the NFPA Core Registered Paralegal CRP framework. A paralegal must not only understand the mechanics of case briefing, but also the hierarchical and persuasive nature of case law. The correct approach involves meticulously analyzing the provided case law, identifying the core facts, the legal issue presented, the rule of law applied by the court's reasoning analysis, and its ultimate decision conclusion. Crucially, it requires distinguishing between binding and persuasive authority based on the jurisdiction of the courts and the level of the court within that jurisdiction. For instance, a decision from the U.S. Supreme Court is binding on all federal and state courts. A decision from a federal circuit court of appeals is binding on all district courts within that circuit, but only persuasive in other circuits. A decision from a state Supreme Court is binding on all lower courts within that state, but only persuasive in federal courts or other state courts. This rigorous process ensures that legal arguments are grounded in established law, and that the paralegal provides accurate and reliable support to the attorney. The NFPA Code of Ethics and Professional Responsibility emphasizes competence and diligence, which are directly served by this thorough case law analysis. An incorrect approach would be to simply summarize the facts of each case without identifying the legal issue or the rule of law, failing to grasp the precedential value. This overlooks the analytical core of case briefing and precedent. Another incorrect approach would be to treat all cited cases as equally authoritative, regardless of their origin or the hierarchy of the courts that issued them. This demonstrates a misunderstanding of stare decisis and the distinction between binding and persuasive authority, leading to potentially flawed legal advice or strategy. Furthermore, an incorrect approach would be to misinterpret the holding of a case, applying a broad principle where the court's decision was narrowly tailored to the specific facts, or vice versa. This misapplication of precedent can undermine the credibility of legal work and lead to significant errors in legal strategy. Professional decision-making in such situations requires a systematic approach. First, understand the factual context of the current matter. Second, identify the legal questions that need to be answered. Third, conduct thorough legal research to locate relevant case law. Fourth, critically read and brief each relevant case, focusing on the facts, issue, rule, analysis, and conclusion. Fifth, determine the precedential weight of each case based on its jurisdiction and the court's level. And finally, synthesize the relevant precedent to support the legal argument or advise the attorney. Question 4. The control framework reveals that during trial preparation for a civil litigation matter governed by the federal rules of evidence, a paralegal is reviewing witness statements. One witness, Ms. Smith, reports that her neighbor, Mr. Jones, immediately after witnessing the incident in question, exclaimed, "I saw him do it. He was definitely the one who ran the red light." Ms. Smith is prepared to testify to what Mr. Jones said. Considering the NFPA Core Registered Paralegal CRP, exams focus on trial practice and evidence. Which of the following approaches best reflects the paralegal's responsibility in handling this information? Option A. Advise the attorney that Ms. Smith's testimony about Mr. Jones's statement is inadmissible hearsay and should not be pursued. Option B. Inform the attorney that Ms. Smith's testimony is admissible because it is relevant to the incident, without further analysis of its evidentiary nature. Option C. Advise the attorney to present Ms. Smith's testimony as is, assuming the court will allow it because it is a direct observation. Option D. Present the statement to the attorney, noting it is an out-of-court statement, and research whether it qualifies as an excited utterance or another hearsay exception. Correct answer is A. Advise the attorney that Ms. Smith's testimony about Mr. Jones's statement is inadmissible hearsay and should not be pursued. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in trial practice, balancing the need to present a strong case with adherence to the rules of evidence, specifically concerning hearsay. Paralegal assisting in trial preparation must understand the nuances of these rules to advise the attorney effectively and ensure admissible evidence is presented. The professional challenge lies in identifying potential hearsay issues and knowing the applicable exceptions, which requires a deep understanding of the NFPA ethical guidelines and the federal rules of evidence as interpreted by the CRP exam. The correct approach involves recognizing that the witness's statement, while potentially relevant, is an out-of-court statement offered to prove the truth of the matter asserted, thus constituting hearsay. However, the paralegal must also identify if any exceptions to the hearsay rule apply. In this case, the statement made by the witness's neighbor about the defendant's actions immediately after the incident could fall under the excited utterance exception, provided the statement was made while the neighbor was under the stress of excitement caused by the event. The paralegal's role is to flag this potential hearsay and research the applicability of exceptions, advising the attorney on the likelihood of admissibility. This aligns with the NFPA emphasis on competence and diligence, ensuring the attorney is fully informed about evidentiary challenges. An incorrect approach would be to simply present the neighbor's statement to the attorney without any analysis of its evidentiary status. This fails to demonstrate competence and diligence, as it places the entire burden of identifying hearsay and its exceptions on the attorney, potentially leading to wasted preparation time or the introduction of inadmissible evidence. Another incorrect approach would be to definitively advise the attorney that the statement is inadmissible hearsay without considering any potential exceptions. This demonstrates a lack of thoroughness and an incomplete understanding of the rules of evidence. Finally, advising the attorney to present the statement without reservation, assuming it will be admitted, is also incorrect. This approach ignores the potential for objection and fails to prepare for evidentiary challenges, which is a critical aspect of trial readiness. Professional decision-making in such situations requires a systematic process. First, identify the potential evidentiary issue, hearsay. Second, determine if the statement is being offered for the truth of the matter asserted. Third, research applicable exceptions to the hearsay rule. Fourth, assess the likelihood of the exception applying based on the specific facts and case law. Finally, communicate these findings and recommendations clearly and concisely to the supervising attorney, enabling them to make informed strategic decisions about evidence presentation. Question 5. Quality control measures reveal that a paralegal working under the supervision of an attorney in a civil litigation matter has received a final judgment unfavorable to their client. The paralegal is aware that the client is dissatisfied and is considering options. The paralegal has researched various post-trial procedures and is contemplating advising the client on the next steps. Which of the following actions, if taken by the paralegal, be the most appropriate and ethically sound, adhering strictly to the NFPA Core Registered Paralegal (CRP) framework and U.S. civil procedure? Option A. Inform the client that the paralegal will prepare and file a motion for judgment notwithstanding the verdict (JNOV) on their behalf, as this is a common post-trial remedy. Option B. Recommend to the client that the most effective next step is to file a motion for a new trial, as this is a standard procedure after any unfavorable outcome. Option C. Advise the client that the judgment is final and unappealable, and that the only recourse is to accept the outcome, without consulting the supervising attorney. Option D. Discuss the client's dissatisfaction and potential post-trial options with the supervising attorney, who will then determine the appropriate course of action, which may include filing a motion for a new trial, a motion for J-Nov, or advising on an appeal. Correct answer is B. Recommend to the client that the most effective next step is to file a motion for a new trial, as this is a standard procedure after any unfavorable outcome. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a paralegal to navigate complex post-trial procedures with strict adherence to the National Federation of Paralegal Associations, NFPA, Core Registered Paralegal, CRP standards, which emphasize accuracy, ethical conduct, and client advocacy within the defined regulatory framework. The paralegal must understand the nuances of post-trial motions, the appellate process, and the enforcement of judgments, all while operating within the confines of the NFPA ethical guidelines and the procedural rules governing the jurisdiction. Misinterpreting these procedures can lead to significant negative consequences for the client, including the loss of rights or the inability to collect a favorable judgment. The correct approach involves a thorough understanding of the client's objectives and the procedural posture of the case. It requires the paralegal to identify the appropriate post-trial motion based on the grounds for relief sought, such as seeking to alter the judgment or obtain a new trial. If an appeal is contemplated, the paralegal must ensure all deadlines are met and that the necessary documentation is prepared accurately for the appellate court. For judgment enforcement, the paralegal must be aware of the various legal mechanisms available and ensure they are employed correctly and ethically. This approach is justified by the NFPA emphasis on competence, diligence, and the duty to provide competent representation. Adhering to these principles ensures that the client's interests are protected and that the paralegal acts within the scope of their authorized duties, upholding the integrity of the legal process. An incorrect approach would be to assume that a motion for a new trial is always appropriate after any adverse ruling, without considering the specific grounds for such a motion as defined by procedural rules. This fails to recognize that different post-trial motions have distinct legal bases and purposes. Another incorrect approach would be to advise the client on the merits of an appeal without consulting with the supervising attorney, thereby exceeding the paralegal's scope of authority and potentially providing unauthorized legal advice. Furthermore, attempting to initiate enforcement actions without a clear understanding of the judgment's terms or the applicable enforcement statutes would be a significant ethical and procedural failure, potentially leading to sanctions or the invalidation of enforcement efforts. These failures violate the NFPA ethical canons regarding competence, unauthorized practice of law, and diligence. Professional decision-making in such situations requires a systematic process. First, the paralegal must clearly define the client's goals and the current status of the litigation. Second, they must identify the relevant procedural rules and legal principles governing post-trial actions within the applicable jurisdiction. Third, they must consult with the supervising attorney to discuss strategy, obtain guidance, and ensure all actions are authorized and aligned with the attorney's representation plan. Finally, the paralegal must meticulously prepare all necessary documentation, adhering to all deadlines and procedural requirements, and maintain clear and accurate communication with the attorney. Question 6. Market research demonstrates that a paralegal is assisting an attorney in initiating a civil lawsuit on behalf of a client residing in California against a defendant corporation headquartered in Delaware, with operations and a significant customer base in New York. The amount in controversy is estimated to be $150,000. The attorney has asked the paralegal to prepare the initial filing documents. Which of the following approaches best ensures compliance with federal procedural rules and jurisdictional requirements for initiating this action? Option A. Draft a complaint for filing in a federal district court, alleging a breach of contract claim, and assume that personal jurisdiction over the Delaware corporation is automatically established due to its business operations. Option B. Draft a complaint for filing in a California state court, focusing solely on the client's residence and the defendant's business activities within California, and omitting any mention of federal jurisdiction. Option C. Draft a complaint for filing in a federal district court, clearly stating that jurisdiction is based on diversity of citizenship under 28 U.S.C. Section 1332, outlining the citizenship of the parties, and asserting that the amount in controversy exceeds $75,000, along with a plain statement of the claim for relief. Option D. Draft a complaint for filing in a New York State court, alleging a breach of contract claim and demanding damages, without explicitly stating the basis for federal jurisdiction. Correct answer is D. Draft a complaint for filing in a New York State court, alleging a breach of contract claim and demanding damages, without explicitly stating the basis for federal jurisdiction. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a paralegal to navigate complex jurisdictional rules within the context of civil procedure, specifically concerning the initial stages of litigation. The paralegal must accurately identify the appropriate court and the foundational legal documents that initiate a lawsuit, ensuring compliance with the National Federation of Paralegal Associations, NFPA, Core Registered Paralegal CRP standards. Misinterpreting these requirements can lead to significant procedural errors, potentially causing delays, increased costs, and prejudice to the client's case. The correct approach involves a thorough understanding of federal subject matter jurisdiction, specifically diversity jurisdiction as defined by 28 U.S.C. Section 1332, and the procedural requirements for drafting a complaint under the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure, FRCP. This approach correctly identifies that a federal district court has jurisdiction when the parties are citizens of different states and the amount in controversy exceeds $75,000. It also correctly recognizes that the complaint is the initial pleading that must state the grounds for federal jurisdiction, a plain statement of the claim showing entitlement to relief, and a demand for judgment. This aligns with the CRP's responsibility to assist in case preparation by ensuring foundational legal documents are correctly filed in the appropriate venue, adhering to the FRCP. An incorrect approach would be to file the lawsuit in a state court without a clear basis for federal jurisdiction, such as diversity or a federal question. This fails to meet the subject matter jurisdiction requirements for federal court and ignores the specific rules governing federal litigation. Another incorrect approach would be to file a complaint that merely states a cause of action without articulating the basis for federal jurisdiction, thereby violating FRCP 8A.1. This demonstrates a lack of understanding of the essential elements required for a federal complaint. A third incorrect approach would be to assume personal jurisdiction exists without analyzing the defendant's contacts with the forum state, which is a separate but equally critical jurisdictional hurdle. This oversight could lead to the dismissal of the case for lack of personal jurisdiction, even if subject matter jurisdiction is proper. Professional decision-making in such situations requires a systematic evaluation of the facts against the relevant jurisdictional statutes and procedural rules. Paralegals must first determine if federal jurisdiction exists, subject matter and personal, and then ensure the pleadings meet the requirements of the FRCP for the chosen forum. When in doubt, consulting with the supervising attorney is paramount to ensure compliance and protect the client's interests. Question 7. The assessment process reveals that a paralegal has been tasked with preparing an internal legal memorandum for a supervising attorney regarding a complex factual scenario involving potential breach of contract. The paralegal has researched the issue and found several cases that support the client's position, but also a significant number of cases that appear to contradict it. The paralegal is considering drafting the memorandum with a strong, persuasive tone, highlighting only the favorable case law and downplaying the unfavorable precedents, believing this will best advocate for the client's interest to the attorney. Which of the following approaches best reflects the professional and ethical obligations of a registered paralegal in this situation? Option A. Draft the memorandum in the style of a legal brief, including a statement of facts, argument section, and conclusion, using persuasive language throughout to convince the attorney of the client's strong case. Option B. Draft the memorandum by summarizing the findings from secondary legal sources that discuss the relevant contract law, as these sources provide a good overview of the legal landscape. Option C. Draft the memorandum with a persuasive tone, emphasizing the favorable case law and briefly mentioning the unfavorable precedents as distinguishable or less relevant, to present the strongest possible argument for the client. Option D. Draft the memorandum using an objective tone, thoroughly analyzing both the supporting and contradicting case law, and clearly explaining how each precedent applies or does not apply to the client's facts, even if it weakens the client's position. The correct answer is D. Draft the memorandum using an objective tone, thoroughly analyzing both the supporting and contradicting case law, and clearly explaining how each precedent applies or does not apply to the client's facts, even if it weakens the client's position. Explanation. The assessment process reveals a common challenge for paralegals, balancing the need for clear, objective reporting with the strategic imperative of persuasive advocacy. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the paralegal to understand the distinct purposes of different legal writing formats and to apply them appropriately based on the intended audience and objective. Misjudging the appropriate writing style can lead to ineffective communication, misrepresentation of facts, or even ethical breaches if the writing is misleading or unsupported. Careful judgment is required to ensure that legal documents serve their intended purpose without compromising accuracy or integrity. The correct approach involves recognizing that a legal memorandum is primarily an objective analysis of the law as applied to the facts, intended for internal use by an attorney. It requires a neutral tone, thorough research, and a balanced presentation of arguments for both sides. This approach aligns with the NFPA Core Registered Paralegal (CRP) competency in legal research and writing, which emphasizes accuracy, clarity, and adherence to professional standards. The ethical duty of candor to the tribunal and the client necessitates presenting information truthfully and without distortion, which is best achieved through objective writing in internal legal memoranda. An incorrect approach would be to adopt a persuasive tone and selectively present facts and law in the legal memorandum. This fails to meet the core purpose of a memorandum, which is to provide the supervising attorney with an unbiased assessment to aid in decision-making. Ethically, this approach risks misleading the attorney, potentially leading to flawed legal strategy or advice. It also violates the principle of thoroughness expected of a paralegal, as it omits or downplays unfavorable information. Another incorrect approach would be to present the legal memorandum as a brief to a court. This is fundamentally flawed because a memorandum is an internal document, while a brief is an external advocacy document. Using the format and tone of a brief in a memorandum would be inappropriate and unprofessional, failing to serve the attorney's need for objective analysis. It also demonstrates a lack of understanding of the distinct roles and audiences for different legal writing types, a core skill for a registered paralegal. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to rely solely on secondary sources without verifying the primary law. While secondary sources can be helpful for initial understanding, a registered paralegal must be able to identify, research, and cite primary legal authority statutes, case law, regulations, to support legal arguments and analyses. Failing to do so renders the memorandum incomplete and potentially inaccurate, undermining its utility and the paralegal's credibility. The professional decision-making process for such situations involves first identifying the purpose of the document and its intended audience. For an internal legal memorandum, the purpose is objective analysis for the supervising attorney. This dictates the tone, structure, and content. The paralegal must then conduct thorough research, identify all relevant legal authorities, and present a balanced analysis of the strengths and weaknesses of the case, citing accurately and comprehensively. If the document were a legal brief, the purpose would be persuasive advocacy, requiring a different approach to tone and argument selection, but still grounded in accurate and ethical representation of the law. Question 8. The evaluation methodology shows that a paralegal is tasked with investigating a complex commercial dispute. The paralegal needs to gather evidence regarding the financial dealings between two companies. Which of the following investigative approaches best aligns with the ethical and regulatory framework for a National Federation of Paralegal Associations, NFPA, Core Registered Paralegal, CRP in the United States? Option A. Accessing publicly available court filings and news articles related to the companies, and assuming this information is comprehensive and accurate without further verification. Option B. Engaging a private investigator to conduct covert surveillance on the opposing company's executives to obtain evidence of financial impropriety. Option C. Interviewing key employees of the opposing company after informing them of the paralegal's role and purpose, and requesting voluntary production of relevant financial documents. Option D, posing as a potential investor to gain access to the opposing company's internal financial records, and then copying sensitive documents without authorization. The correct answer is C, interviewing key employees of the opposing company after informing them of the paralegal's role and purpose, and requesting voluntary production of relevant financial documents. Explanation: this scenario presents a common professional challenge for a paralegal, balancing the need for thorough fact investigation with ethical obligations and jurisdictional rules. The challenge lies in gathering all relevant information efficiently and effectively while respecting privacy, avoiding misrepresentation, and ensuring the integrity of the investigation. Careful judgment is required to navigate potential conflicts between zealous advocacy and ethical boundaries. The correct approach involves a systematic and ethical method of fact investigation, prioritizing direct communication with individuals and authorized document retrieval. This aligns with the National Federation of Paralegal Associations, NFPA Core Registered Paralegal CRP standards, which emphasize honesty, integrity, and competence. Specifically, interviewing witnesses directly and requesting documents through proper channels, such as subpoenas or voluntary production, adheres to ethical guidelines that prohibit deception or misrepresentation. Conducting background checks through legitimate and authorized means, respecting privacy laws and ethical considerations, is also crucial. This approach ensures that information is obtained legally and ethically, forming a solid and admissible foundation for legal proceedings. An incorrect approach would be to misrepresent oneself to gain access to information. For instance, impersonating a client or an attorney to obtain documents or information from a witness is a clear violation of ethical rules and potentially illegal. This constitutes misrepresentation and dishonesty, undermining the credibility of the investigation and the paralegal. Another incorrect approach would be to engage in unauthorized surveillance or to obtain confidential information through illicit means, such as hacking or bribing individuals. These actions are not only unethical but also illegal, leading to severe professional repercussions and potential legal penalties. Furthermore, relying solely on publicly available information without attempting to verify its accuracy or completeness, or without seeking direct testimony, can lead to an incomplete or misleading understanding of the facts, which is a failure of due diligence. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of the relevant jurisdictional rules and ethical codes governing paralegals. Before undertaking any investigative step, a paralegal should ask, is this action legal? Is this action ethical? Does this action align with the NFPA standards of conduct? If there is any doubt, seeking guidance from the supervising attorney is paramount. A systematic approach, prioritizing direct and authorized methods of information gathering, and always maintaining transparency and honesty, will ensure a robust and ethically sound investigation. Question 9. Risk assessment procedures indicate that a paralegal is tasked with researching the enforceability of a newly enacted state statute concerning data privacy. The paralegal has access to Westlaw and LexisNexis. Which of the following research methodologies, when employed strategically and in combination, would most effectively and efficiently yield the relevant legal authority, ensuring compliance with the expected standards of a National Federation of Paralegal Associations, NFPA, Core Registered Paralegal, CRP? Option A. Conducting initial broad keyword searches to identify core concepts and relevant terminology, followed by targeted Boolean searches to refine the scope and retrieve specific statutory language and case law interpreting similar provisions, and then utilizing citation searching to identify subsequent decisions and related authorities. Option B. Focusing exclusively on citation searching of a few known foundational cases in the general area of data privacy, without first establishing the specific parameters of the new statute. Option C. Primarily relying on broad keyword searches across all available databases without employing Boolean operators or advanced search filters, and then performing a cursory review of the initial results. Option D. Utilizing only the basic search functions of Westlaw and LexisNexis, such as simple term searches, and avoiding the use of citator services or advanced search connectors. The correct answer is C. Primarily relying on broad keyword searches across all available databases without employing Boolean operators or advanced search filters, and then performing a cursory review of the initial results. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a paralegal to efficiently and accurately locate relevant legal authority within a complex and rapidly evolving body of law, while adhering to the specific research tools and methodologies sanctioned by the NFPA Core Registered Paralegal (CRP) framework. The paralegal must balance the need for thoroughness with the practical constraints of time and resources, ensuring that the research conducted is both legally sound and ethically defensible. The risk lies in overlooking critical precedents or statutes, or in utilizing research methods that are inefficient or prone to error, which could negatively impact the client's case and expose the supervising attorney to malpractice claims. The correct approach involves a systematic and strategic application of legal research methodologies, prioritizing those that offer the most comprehensive and precise results within the specified databases. This includes leveraging advanced search techniques like Boolean logic to refine searches and Boolean searching to connect concepts, utilizing keyword searching for initial exploration and to identify relevant terms, and employing citation searching to trace the lineage of important cases and statutes. Proficiency in using Westlaw and LexisNexis, including their specialized features and advanced search functionalities, is paramount. This approach is correct because it aligns with the core competencies expected of a CRP, emphasizing accuracy, efficiency, and the ethical obligation to conduct thorough research. The NFPA Code of Ethics and Professional Responsibility implicitly requires paralegals to possess and apply competent legal research skills to assist attorneys effectively. An incorrect approach would be to rely solely on basic keyword searching without employing Boolean operators or other advanced techniques. This can lead to an overwhelming number of irrelevant results, or, conversely, miss crucial authorities due to the narrowness of the search terms. This failure to utilize more sophisticated research tools represents a lack of due diligence and can be seen as a breach of the paralegal's duty of competence. Another incorrect approach would be to exclusively use citation searching without first establishing a foundational understanding of the relevant legal issues through keyword or Boolean searches. While citation searching is valuable for validating and expanding upon existing research, it is not an effective method for initial discovery of relevant law. This can result in a fragmented understanding of the legal landscape and potentially lead to the misinterpretation of case law. A further incorrect approach would be to neglect the advanced features of Westlaw and LexisNexis, such as their citator services, e.g., key cite or shepherds, or specialized search filters. This would be a failure to utilize the full capabilities of the sanctioned research platforms, leading to less efficient and potentially less accurate research. It demonstrates a lack of mastery over the tools of the trade, which is a professional failing. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve 1. Clearly defining the research objective and scope. 2. Strategically selecting the most appropriate research methodologies and tools based on the nature of the legal issue and the available resources. 3. Executing searches systematically, refining terms and operators as needed. 4. Critically evaluating search results for relevance and authority. 5. Verifying the currency and validity of all found authorities using citator services. 6. Documenting the research process and findings thoroughly. Question 10. The performance metrics show a consistent need for clarity regarding property ownership structures in client intake. A client is seeking to understand how their property will be handled upon their passing, and they have indicated that they own a property jointly with their sibling, with the deed explicitly stating to client and sibling as joint tenants with right of survivorship. The client also mentions a separate property they inherited from their grandmother, which is currently held to client for life, then to client's children in fee simple. Based on these descriptions and assuming U.S. property law, which of the following accurately categorizes the ownership types for both properties? Option A. The jointly owned property is held as joint tenancy, and the inherited property is held as fee simple absolute. Option B. The jointly owned property is held as tenancy in common, and the inherited property is held as fee simple absolute. Option C. The jointly owned property is held as joint tenancy, and the inherited property is held as a life estate with a remainder interest. Option D. The jointly owned property is held as tenancy in common, and the inherited property is held as a life estate with a remainder interest. The correct answer is C. The jointly owned property is held as joint tenancy, and the inherited property is held as a life estate with a remainder interest. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the potential for misinterpreting or misapplying fundamental property ownership concepts, which can lead to significant legal and financial consequences for clients. Paralegal must possess a thorough understanding of these distinctions to accurately advise clients and draft appropriate legal documents. The core of the challenge lies in recognizing how different ownership types affect rights, responsibilities, and the disposition of property upon death or sale. The correct approach involves accurately identifying the type of ownership based on the provided facts and understanding its implications under U.S. property law, as governed by the NFPA Core Registered Paralegal (CRP) framework. This requires a precise application of legal definitions to the client's situation. For instance, understanding that joint tenancy includes the right of survivorship, while tenancy in common does not, is crucial for advising on estate planning and inheritance. Fee simple absolute grants the most complete ownership rights, while a life estate is limited by the duration of a specific person's life. An incorrect approach would be to generalize or confuse the characteristics of these ownership types. For example, assuming that all co-ownership automatically includes the right of survivorship, confusing tenancy in common with joint tenancy, would be a critical error. Another failure would be to overlook the limitations inherent in a life estate, such as the life tenant's inability to convey fee simple title without the consent of the remaindermen. Misapplying these concepts can lead to incorrect legal advice, flawed document drafting, and potential litigation, violating ethical duties of competence and diligence owed to the client. Professionals should approach such situations by first meticulously gathering all relevant facts about the property and the parties involved. Then, they must systematically analyze these facts against the established legal definitions of each ownership type. When in doubt, consulting with the supervising attorney is paramount to ensure accuracy and protect the client's interests. This systematic, fact-driven, and attorney-supervised approach is essential for maintaining professional integrity and competence. Question 11. Cost-benefit analysis shows that while extensive pretrial preparation is crucial, a paralegal must strategically allocate resources. Considering the NFPA Core Registered Paralegal (CRP) standards and U.S. procedural rules, which approach best balances thoroughness, ethical obligations, and efficient trial preparation regarding witness preparation, exhibit management, jury selection, opening statements, and closing arguments. Option A. Concentrate solely on exhibit preparation, ensuring all documents are filed, and delegate witness preparation entirely to the attorney, while focusing paralegal efforts on drafting generic opening and closing statement outlines. Option B. Prioritize the rapid identification and submission of a large volume of exhibits, provide witnesses with pre-written scripts to ensure consistent testimony, and leave jury selection strategy entirely to the attorney without any paralegal input on potential biases. Option C. Focus on meticulously organizing and marking all potential exhibits, thoroughly preparing witnesses to testify factually and ethically, assisting the attorney in identifying potential juror biases during voir dire, and providing well-researched factual summaries for opening and closing statements. Option D. Minimize time spent on exhibit organization, rely on witness memory without formal preparation, and focus jury selection on superficial juror characteristics, assuming the attorney will handle all substantive aspects of opening and closing statements. Correct answer is C. Focus on meticulously organizing and marking all potential exhibits, thoroughly preparing witnesses to testify factually and ethically, assisting the attorney in identifying potential juror biases during voir dire, and providing well-researched factual summaries for opening and closing statements. Explanation. This scenario presents a common professional challenge in trial preparation, balancing thoroughness with efficiency while adhering to ethical obligations and the rules of evidence. The paralegal must navigate the complexities of witness preparation, exhibit management, and the strategic presentation of information to the jury, all within the confines of the NFPA Core Registered Paralegal (CRP) standards and applicable U.S. procedural rules. The challenge lies in ensuring all necessary steps are taken to support the attorney's case without overstepping ethical boundaries or creating unnecessary work. The correct approach involves a systematic and ethical preparation process. This includes thoroughly reviewing all potential exhibits for admissibility, ensuring they are properly organized and marked according to court rules. Witness preparation must be comprehensive, focusing on factual accuracy and ethical conduct, ensuring witnesses understand their testimony, and the examination process without suggesting false or misleading statements. Jury selection requires a strategic understanding of voir dire to identify potential biases, guided by the attorney's overall strategy. Opening statements and closing arguments are the attorney's domain, but the paralegal's preparation directly supports their effectiveness by providing accurate information and organized materials. Adherence to the NFPA Code of Ethics and Professional Responsibility, particularly regarding competence, diligence, and avoiding the unauthorized practice of law, is paramount. An incorrect approach would be to prioritize speed over accuracy in exhibit preparation, leading to the inclusion of inadmissible or poorly organized evidence. This could jeopardize the case and reflect a lack of diligence. Another failure would be to coach witnesses on specific answers rather than preparing them to testify truthfully and accurately about their knowledge, which constitutes unethical conduct and potentially witness tampering. Neglecting to identify potential juror biases during voir dire or focusing solely on superficial characteristics rather than substantive issues would be a strategic error that undermines the jury selection process. Failing to provide the attorney with well-researched and organized materials for opening and closing statements would demonstrate a lack of competence and preparedness. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes ethical conduct, adherence to procedural rules, and effective support for the attorney. This involves proactive planning, meticulous attention to detail, continuous communication with the attorney, and a commitment to professional development to stay abreast of relevant legal standards and ethical guidelines. The paralegal's role is to facilitate the attorney's case through diligent and ethical preparation, ensuring all aspects of trial readiness are addressed with the highest professional standards. Question 12. The performance metrics show a consistent pattern of clients expressing frustration with the pace of resolution in their ongoing mediation cases. One client in particular has adamantly stated they will not budge on any of their demands during the upcoming mediation session and expects the paralegal to convey this unwavering position to the mediator. As a registered paralegal, adhering to the NFPA Core Registered Paralegal Standards, how should you advise this client? Option A. Advise the client that while their feelings are understood, an inflexible stance in mediation can often hinder productive dialogue and may lead to an impasse, suggesting they consider potential areas for compromise to achieve a more favorable resolution. Option B. Agree with the client's assessment and assure them that their unwavering stance will be communicated, reinforcing their position without further discussion. Option C. Immediately inform the mediator that the client has adopted a non-negotiable position and will not concede on any demands. Option D. Advise the client that given their firm position, mediation is likely not a suitable process for their case, and they should consider withdrawing from mediation. Correct answer is A. Advise the client that while their feelings are understood, an inflexible stance in mediation can often hinder productive dialogue and may lead to an impasse, suggesting they consider potential areas for compromise to achieve a more favorable resolution. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a paralegal to navigate a situation where a client's immediate emotional state might conflict with the most effective and ethical path forward in an alternative dispute resolution (ADR) process. The paralegal must balance the client's desire for immediate vindication with the principles of negotiation, mediation, and arbitration, all while adhering to the NFPA Code of Ethics and Professional Responsibility. Careful judgment is required to ensure the client's interests are protected without compromising the integrity of the ADR process or the paralegal's professional obligations. The correct approach involves advising the client on the potential consequences of an aggressive, non-negotiable stance in mediation. This approach is right because it prioritizes informed client decision-making and upholds the paralegal's duty of competence and diligence. By explaining how an inflexible position can hinder productive dialogue, potentially lead to an impasse, and ultimately result in a less favorable outcome than could be achieved through compromise, the paralegal is fulfilling their role as a legal advisor. This aligns with the NFPA ethical guidelines that require paralegals to assist clients in understanding legal options and potential outcomes. The paralegal should guide the client toward exploring potential concessions and understanding the mediator's role as a facilitator, not an adjudicator. An incorrect approach would be to simply agree to the client's demand for an aggressive, non-negotiable stance without further discussion. This fails to meet the duty of competence, as it does not involve advising the client on the practical implications of such a strategy within a mediation context. It also risks undermining the mediation process, which relies on a willingness to engage in dialogue and explore solutions. Another incorrect approach would be to unilaterally advise the mediator of the client's inflexible position without the client's explicit consent. This violates client confidentiality and the paralegal's duty to act solely on behalf of the client's instructions, not to interfere with the neutral role of the mediator. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to suggest to the client that they should refuse mediation altogether. While a client has the right to refuse ADR, a paralegal's role is to advise on the benefits and drawbacks of all available options, including mediation, and to facilitate the client's informed choice, not to prematurely steer them away from a potentially beneficial process. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve 1. Actively listening to and understanding the client's objectives and emotional state. 2. Assessing the client's stated position against the realities and objectives of the chosen ADR method, negotiation, mediation, or arbitration. 3. Providing clear, objective advice on the potential benefits and drawbacks of the client's proposed strategy within the specific ADR context, referencing relevant ethical duties. 4. Empowering the client to make an informed decision by explaining the consequences of various approaches. 5. Maintaining client confidentiality and respecting the neutrality of third-party neutrals in mediation or arbitration. Question 13. What factors determine whether extrinsic evidence can be used to interpret a written contract under U.S. law, and how do implied terms fit into this interpretive framework? Option A. The convenience of introducing new evidence, the perceived fairness of the outcome, and the availability of witnesses to support the client's version of events. Option B. The clarity of the contract's language, the presence of ambiguity, the degree of integration of the written agreement, and the nature of the extrinsic evidence in relation to implied terms. Option C. The subjective beliefs of the parties at the time of signing, and any evidence that suggests a different outcome than what is explicitly written. Option D. The client's stated intentions, regardless of the written contract's language, and any informal discussions that occurred prior to signing. The correct answer is B. The clarity of the contract's language, the presence of ambiguity, the degree of integration of the written agreement, and the nature of the extrinsic evidence in relation to implied terms. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a paralegal to navigate the complexities of contract interpretation, specifically balancing the plain meaning of a contract with potential external evidence and implied understandings. A paralegal must exercise careful judgment to ensure they are advocating for their client's position based on sound legal principles, without overstepping the bounds of permissible evidence or making unsupported assumptions. The core challenge lies in determining the true intent of the parties when the written word may not fully capture their agreement. The correct approach involves a thorough analysis of the contract's language according to the plain meaning rule, followed by a careful consideration of whether the parallel evidence rule would permit the introduction of extrinsic evidence to clarify or supplement the agreement. This approach is correct because it adheres to established contract law principles. The plain meaning rule prioritizes the ordinary and common understanding of the terms used in the contract. If the language is unambiguous, courts generally will not look beyond the document itself. However, if ambiguity exists, the parallel evidence rule, as applied in U.S. contract law, dictates that extrinsic evidence cannot be used to contradict or vary the terms of a fully integrated written contract. It can, however, be used to explain ambiguities or to prove fraud, duress, or mistake. Furthermore, the consideration of implied terms, such as those arising from course of dealing, usage of trade, or necessity to give business efficacy to the contract, is a recognized method of contract interpretation when the express terms are insufficient. This methodical approach ensures that the interpretation is grounded in established legal precedent and the specific facts of the case, aligning with the paralegal's duty to provide competent representation within the scope of their authority. An incorrect approach would be to solely rely on the client's subjective interpretation of the contract without considering the objective meaning of the written terms. This fails to acknowledge the plain meaning rule, which is the primary method of contract interpretation. Another incorrect approach would be to disregard the parallel evidence rule and freely introduce any evidence the client provides, regardless of whether it contradicts or varies the written agreement. This would violate fundamental principles of contract law and could lead to the inadmissibility of crucial evidence. A third incorrect approach would be to assume implied terms exist without sufficient factual or legal basis, such as a clear course of dealing or a demonstrable necessity for such terms to make the contract operative. This risks misinterpreting the parties' intentions and advocating for a position not supported by the contract or relevant law. The professional decision-making process for paralegals in such situations should involve 1. A meticulous review of the contract's express terms, applying the plain meaning rule. 2. Identification of any ambiguities in the language. 3. Research into the applicability of the parallel evidence rule to any proposed extrinsic evidence, considering whether the contract is fully integrated and the nature of the evidence. 4. Exploration of potential implied terms based on established legal doctrines and the factual context. 5. Consultation with the supervising attorney regarding complex interpretive issues and the strategic use of evidence. This framework ensures that the paralegal's work is legally sound, ethically compliant, and effectively supports the client's case within the established rules of contract interpretation. Question 14. Examination of the data shows that plaintiff, while attending a professional sporting event, voluntarily purchased a ticket and entered the stadium. During the game, the plaintiff was struck by a foul ball that entered the stands, sustaining injuries. The plaintiff is now suing the stadium owner for negligence in failing to adequately protect spectators from such projectiles. Stadium owner's legal team is considering asserting defenses based on the plaintiff's own actions. Which of the following approaches best reflects the application of tort defenses in this scenario, considering common U.S. legal principles governing spectator injuries at sporting events? Option A. Assert that the plaintiff's own decision to sit in a particular section of the stadium, without further evidence of their awareness of specific risks beyond general knowledge of the sport, constitutes contributory negligence that bars all recovery. Option B. Argue that the plaintiff, by attending the event, voluntarily assumed the risk of being hit by a foul ball, as such an occurrence is an inherent danger of attending a baseball game. Option C. Focus on whether the stadium owner took reasonable precautions to mitigate the risk of foul balls, such as installing netting, and if the plaintiff's injury was a result of the owner's failure to meet this standard of care, while also considering if the plaintiff's own actions contributed to their injury under a comparative fault system. Option D. Claim that the plaintiff's injuries were solely caused by the actions of the batter and the unpredictability of the game, thereby absolving the stadium owner of any responsibility for spectator safety. The correct answer is B. Argue that the plaintiff, by attending the event, voluntarily assumed the risk of being hit by a foul ball, as such an occurrence is an inherent danger of attending a baseball game. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a paralegal to analyze a complex factual situation and apply specific legal doctrines: contributory negligence, comparative negligence, an assumption of risk within the framework of tort law as it exists under U.S. federal and state common law, which is the governing framework for the NFPA CRP exam. The paralegal must accurately identify which defense, if any, is most applicable and how it impacts the potential liability of the defendant. Misapplication of these defenses can lead to incorrect legal advice, flawed case strategy, and ultimately prejudice to the client's interests. Careful judgment is required to distinguish between the nuances of each defense and their respective legal standards. The correct approach involves a thorough understanding of the elements of each defense and their application to the specific facts presented. Contributory negligence, a harsh doctrine, bars recovery entirely if the plaintiff's own negligence contributed to their injury. Comparative negligence, in its various forms, pure or modified, allows for recovery but reduces it by the plaintiff's percentage of fault. Assumption of risk requires the plaintiff to have voluntarily and knowingly encountered a known danger. The paralegal must assess the plaintiff's actions and knowledge to determine which defense, if any, is supported by the evidence and aligns with the prevailing legal standards in the relevant U.S. jurisdiction. This requires precise legal analysis and adherence to established case law and statutory provisions governing tort defenses. An incorrect approach would be to broadly apply a defense without considering the specific factual predicates or the jurisdiction's adopted standard. For instance, treating all plaintiff fault as automatically barring recovery, as in contributory negligence, without acknowledging the prevalence of comparative negligence in most U.S. jurisdictions, would be a significant legal error. Similarly, assuming assumption of risk exists simply because a plaintiff engaged in a potentially risky activity, without demonstrating the plaintiff's actual knowledge and voluntary acceptance of that specific risk, is a misapplication of the doctrine. Another failure would be to conflate the concepts, applying elements of comparative fault to an assumption of risk analysis or vice versa, leading to an inaccurate assessment of liability. Professional decision-making in such situations requires a systematic process. First, thoroughly review all available facts and evidence. Second, identify the potential tort claims and defenses. Third, research the controlling U.S. jurisdiction's laws regarding those claims and defenses, paying close attention to statutes and relevant case law. Fourth, analyze how the facts align with the legal elements of each potential defense. Fifth, consult with the supervising attorney to discuss the analysis and recommended strategy, ensuring all legal and ethical obligations are met. Question 15. When evaluating a client's claim that a contract should be voided due to unfair circumstances, which of the following approaches best aligns with the ethical obligations of a registered paralegal under the NFPA Core Registered Paralegal Framework, assuming the client expresses a strong feeling of being taken advantage of, but provides limited specific details about the negotiation process? Option A. Focus solely on the client's emotional distress, suggesting that this alone may constitute grounds for duress or undue influence, and recommend seeking psychological counseling as a primary step before proceeding with legal action. Option B. Initiate a detailed factual investigation to gather all relevant documents, communications, and witness accounts, and conduct legal research into the specific elements of potential contract defenses such as fraud, duress, undue influence, mistake, and unconscionability to present a comprehensive analysis to the supervising attorney. Option C. Advise the client that their feelings of being taken advantage of are sufficient to pursue a defense of unconscionability and begin drafting legal documents to challenge the contract based on this assertion. Option D. Immediately dismiss the client's concerns as subjective and lacking legal merit, advising them that without concrete evidence of wrongdoing, no contract defense is viable. The correct answer is C. Advise the client that their feelings of being taken advantage of are sufficient to pursue a defense of unconscionability and begin drafting legal documents to challenge the contract based on this assertion. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a paralegal to distinguish between subtle yet legally significant contract defenses, particularly when presented with a client's subjective feelings and a potentially unfavorable outcome. The paralegal must apply the NFPA Code of Ethics and Professional Responsibility, specifically the duty of competence and diligence, to accurately assess the legal viability of the client's claims. Misinterpreting these defenses can lead to incorrect legal advice, wasted client resources, and potential malpractice claims. Correct approach involves a thorough factual investigation and legal research to determine if the elements of fraud, duress, undue influence, mistake, or unconscionability are present under applicable state law, as interpreted through the lens of the NFPA ethical guidelines for paralegals. This means gathering all relevant documents, interviewing witnesses, and researching case law to establish whether the client's assertions meet the legal thresholds for these defenses. The paralegal's role is to present a legally sound analysis to the supervising attorney, not to make the ultimate legal determination. This aligns with the NFPA emphasis on competence and the paralegal's responsibility to assist the attorney in providing competent representation. An incorrect approach would be to rely solely on the client's emotional state or a general feeling of being wronged, without substantiating these feelings with objective evidence that meets the legal definitions of the defenses. For instance, assuming fraud exists simply because the client feels deceived, without proving misrepresentation, intent to deceive, reliance, and damages, is a failure of due diligence and competence. Similarly, concluding duress based on pressure without demonstrating unlawful coercion that overcomes the client's free will is an oversimplification. Mistake requires specific legal elements, such as mutual mistake of fact or unilateral mistake under certain conditions, and cannot be assumed from a bad bargain. Unconscionability requires a showing of extreme unfairness in both the bargaining process and the terms, which goes beyond mere dissatisfaction. Each of these incorrect approaches fails to adhere to the rigorous standards required for establishing contract defenses and violates the paralegal's ethical duty to provide accurate and competent support. The professional decision-making process for similar situations involves a systematic approach. First, understand the client's allegations thoroughly. Second, identify the potential legal defenses that might apply. Third, conduct targeted factual investigations to gather evidence supporting or refuting each element of those defenses. Fourth, perform legal research to understand the specific legal requirements for each defense in the relevant jurisdiction. Fifth, analyze the gathered facts against the legal standards. Finally, present a comprehensive and objective analysis to the supervising attorney, highlighting strengths, weaknesses, and potential risks associated with each defense. This methodical process ensures that the paralegal acts competently and ethically, providing the attorney with the necessary information to advise the client effectively. Question 16. The audit findings indicate that the firm's interpretation of the term significant impact in the new Environmental Protection Act (EPA) may not align with the regulatory intent. The statute states that businesses must implement specific waste reduction measures if their operations have a significant impact on local water tables. The term significant impact is not further defined within the Act itself. The paralegal assigned to this matter has researched the term and found multiple dictionary definitions, ranging from notable to important to large enough to matter. The paralegal is considering how to advise clients on compliance. Which of the following approaches best reflects the principles of statutory interpretation for determining the meaning of significant impact in this context? Option A. Rely solely on the dictionary definition of significant that suggests a large quantitative threshold, as this provides a clear, objective standard for compliance. Option B. Focus on the canon of statutory construction that favors the broadest possible interpretation of terms to maximize regulatory coverage, regardless of specific legislative intent. Option C. Adopt the dictionary definition of significant that is most favorable to the client's operational ease, as the primary goal is to ensure client compliance without undue burden. Option D. Prioritize the legislative intent behind the EPA, using the plain meaning of significant as a starting point and applying relevant canons of construction to resolve any remaining ambiguity. The correct answer is D. Prioritize the legislative intent behind the EPA, using the plain meaning of significant as a starting point and applying relevant canons of construction to resolve any remaining ambiguity. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a paralegal to navigate ambiguity in statutory language to ensure compliance with a new regulation. The paralegal must move beyond a superficial understanding of the law and engage in a rigorous analysis of legislative intent and established interpretive rules to arrive at the correct application. Failure to do so could result in noncompliance, potential penalties, and damage to the firm's reputation. Careful judgment is required to select the most appropriate interpretive approach that aligns with the spirit and letter of the law as intended by the legislature. The correct approach involves prioritizing legislative intent, supported by the plain meaning rule and canons of construction, to interpret the ambiguous term significant impact. This approach is professionally sound because it adheres to fundamental principles of statutory interpretation recognized within the U.S. legal system, which the NFPA CRP exam framework is based upon. The plain meaning rule dictates that words of a statute are to be given their ordinary and common meaning unless the statute clearly indicates otherwise. When plain meaning is insufficient or leads to absurd results, courts and legal professionals look to legislative intent, examining committee reports, floor debates, and the overall purpose of the legislation. Canons of construction, such as the rule of the last antecedent or the principle that statutes in pari materia should be construed together, provide further guidance. By considering these elements, the paralegal ensures an interpretation that is most likely to reflect what the legislature intended when enacting the statute, thereby promoting accurate compliance. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on a dictionary definition of significant without considering the statutory context or legislative intent fails to acknowledge the nuances of legal interpretation. While dictionaries can be a starting point, they do not capture the specific meaning intended by lawmakers within a particular regulatory framework. This approach risks misinterpreting the statute, leading to noncompliance. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes a more lenient interpretation to avoid burdening clients, without a clear legal basis for such leniency, is ethically problematic. Professional responsibility requires adherence to the law as written and intended, not a subjective application based on desired outcomes for clients. This approach undermines the integrity of the legal process and could expose the firm to liability. A third incorrect approach that relies on a single, isolated canon of construction, without considering the overall legislative intent or the plain meaning of the words, is also flawed. Canons are tools to aid interpretation, not substitutes for understanding the statute's purpose. Over-reliance on a single canon can lead to an interpretation that is inconsistent with the broader legislative scheme. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic approach. 1. Identify the ambiguous term or provision. 2. Apply the plain meaning rule. What is the ordinary common meaning of the words? 3. If plain meaning is unclear or leads to absurd results, investigate legislative intent, review legislative history, committee reports, and the overall purpose of the statute. 4. Consider relevant canons of construction as aids to interpretation, but do not let them override clear legislative intent or plain meaning. 5. Synthesize findings from these interpretive tools to arrive at the most reasonable and legally defensible interpretation. 6. Document the interpretive process and the rationale for the chosen interpretation. 7. Consult with an attorney if significant doubt or complexity remains. Question 17. Market research demonstrates that a paralegal working on a civil litigation matter has received a settlement offer from opposing counsel. The client has expressed a desire to settle the case quickly. The paralegal has reviewed the offer and believes it is significantly below the potential value of the case, but also recognizes the client's urgency. What is the most appropriate course of action for the paralegal? Option A. Contact opposing counsel to discuss the perceived inadequacy of the offer and propose alternative settlement figures that the paralegal believes are more reasonable. Option B. Advise the client that they should accept the offer to expedite the resolution of the case, as the client has indicated a desire for speed. Option C. Prepare a summary of the settlement offer for the supervising attorney, highlighting the client's desire for a quick resolution and the paralegal's preliminary assessment of the offer's value relative to the case. Option D. Inform the client that the settlement offer is too low and suggest counteroffer terms based on the paralegal's assessment of the case value. The correct answer is D. Inform the client that the settlement offer is too low and suggest counteroffer terms based on the paralegal's assessment of the case value. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in civil litigation, where a paralegal must navigate the ethical and regulatory boundaries of client communication and case management. The core of the challenge lies in balancing the paralegal's duty to assist the attorney with the prohibition against engaging in the unauthorized practice of law oople. A paralegal's actions must always be supervised by an attorney and should not involve independent legal judgment or advice. The correct approach involves diligently gathering information and preparing documents under the direct supervision of the attorney, ensuring all substantive legal decisions and client communications are handled by the attorney. This aligns with NFPA ethical guidelines, which emphasize that paralegals must work under attorney supervision and cannot provide legal advice. Specifically, Guideline Roman 3. A. 1 states that a paralegal shall not perform any function that the lawyer is prohibited from performing. Providing legal advice or independently negotiating settlements falls squarely within the attorney's exclusive domain. An incorrect approach would be to independently contact the opposing counsel to discuss settlement terms. This constitutes UPL because it involves making substantive legal judgments about the case's value and potential settlement, which is the attorney's responsibility. This action violates NFPA ethical guidelines, particularly Guideline Roman 3. A. 1. By performing a function reserved for attorneys. Another incorrect approach would be to advise the client on the merits of the settlement offer. This is also UPL, as it involves providing legal advice and analysis of the case's strengths and weaknesses, which is solely the attorney's role. This directly contravenes the principle of attorney supervision and the prohibition against paralegals offering legal opinions. A third incorrect approach would be to draft a settlement agreement without attorney review and then present it to the client for signature. While drafting is a paralegal function, presenting a substantive legal document for client action without attorney oversight and approval is problematic. The attorney must review and approve all such documents before they are finalized or presented to the client for decision-making, ensuring compliance with legal standards and client best interests. The professional decision-making process for paralegals in similar situations should involve a clear understanding of the scope of their duties and limitations. When faced with a situation that might involve independent legal judgment or client advice, the paralegal must err on the side of caution and consult with the supervising attorney. This involves asking clarifying questions, seeking guidance on how to proceed, and ensuring that all actions taken are within the bounds of ethical and regulatory compliance, always prioritizing attorney supervision. Question 18. Regulatory review indicates that a paralegal is assisting an attorney in drafting a contract for the purchase of 50 new laptop computers from a technology vendor by a retail business. The contract specifies delivery terms and payment schedules. Which of the following legal frameworks would be the most appropriate to guide the paralegal's understanding and drafting of this contract? Option A. Common law principles of general contract law. Option B. Article 2 of the Uniform Commercial Code, UC. Option C. State employment law statutes. Option D. State statutes governing real estate transactions. The correct answer is B. Article 2 of the Uniform Commercial Code, UC. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a paralegal to accurately identify the governing legal framework for a contract based on its subject matter. Misidentifying the applicable law can lead to incorrect advice, flawed document drafting, and potential liability for the supervising attorney and the paralegal. Paralegal must demonstrate a nuanced understanding of how different types of contracts are regulated under U.S. law, specifically as it pertains to the National Federation of Paralegal Associations, NFPA Core, Registered Paralegal, CRP, exam scope. The correct approach involves recognizing that a contract for the sale of goods between merchants is governed by Article 2 of the Uniform Commercial Code, UC, as adopted by the relevant state. This is because the UCC provides a standardized set of rules for commercial transactions involving goods, aiming for uniformity and predictability. A paralegal adhering to this approach would correctly identify the UCC as the primary source of law for such a transaction, ensuring that all contractual provisions and interpretations align with its requirements. This aligns with the CRP's responsibility to understand and apply relevant legal principles under attorney supervision. An incorrect approach would be to apply general contract law principles without considering the UCC. General contract law, often derived from common law, governs many types of agreements, but is superseded by the UCC for sales of goods. Applying common law principles to a UCC transaction could lead to the omission of UCC-specific requirements, such as those related to offer, acceptance, and warranties, potentially rendering the contract unenforceable or creating unintended liabilities. Another incorrect approach would be to assume that all contracts are governed by real estate law. Real estate contracts pertain specifically to the transfer of interests in land and are governed by state statutes and common law, not the UCC. Applying real estate principles to a sale of goods would be fundamentally misapplied and would fail to address the unique legal considerations for tangible personal property. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to treat the contract as a service contract. Service contracts are governed by common law principles of contract law, focusing on the performance of labor or services rather than the transfer of goods. Confusing a sale of goods with a service contract would lead to the application of inappropriate legal standards and potentially incorrect advice regarding warranties, remedies, and performance obligations. Professional decision-making in such situations requires a systematic analysis of the contract's core subject matter. The paralegal should ask, what is being exchanged? Is it tangible personal property, goods, real estate, labor/services, or employment? Once the subject matter is identified, the paralegal can then determine the most applicable body of law, whether it be the UCC, state real estate statutes, or common law principles governing services and employment. Question 19. Process analysis reveals that a supervising attorney has asked a paralegal to research the admissibility of certain evidence in a pending state court case. The paralegal finds a recent, well-reasoned opinion from a federal appellate court in another circuit that addresses a similar evidentiary issue, as well as an older, less detailed opinion from a state trial court within the same jurisdiction. The paralegal also finds a scholarly law review article that discusses the evidentiary issue extensively. Which approach best demonstrates adherence to the principles of case law analysis and understanding of precedent for a National Federation of Paralegal Associations, NFPA, Core Registered Paralegal, CRP? Option A. Analyzing the older state trial court opinion for its precedential value within the jurisdiction and briefing it, and also analyzing the federal appellate court opinion and the law review article for their persuasive value, citing all appropriately. Option B. Prioritizing the older state trial court opinion due to its presence within the same jurisdiction and briefing it thoroughly, while disregarding the federal and law review sources. Option C. Relying solely on the federal appellate court opinion, assuming its reasoning will be persuasive to the state court, and preparing a brief based on that single source. Option D. Briefing the federal appellate court opinion and the law review article, citing them as primary authority for the evidentiary issue. The correct answer is D. Briefing the federal appellate court opinion and the law review article, citing them as primary authority for the evidentiary issue. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a paralegal to synthesize information from multiple sources, identify the most relevant legal authority, and apply it accurately to a client's situation. The paralegal must demonstrate a nuanced understanding of precedent, distinguishing between binding and persuasive authority, and correctly cite legal sources to ensure the integrity of their work product. Failure to do so can lead to misinformed legal advice, potential malpractice claims, and damage to the attorney's reputation and the firm's credibility. The correct approach involves meticulously analyzing the provided case law, identifying the core legal issue presented, and then determining which prior decisions are binding on the current jurisdiction. This requires understanding the doctrine of stare decisis and recognizing that a decision from a higher court within the same jurisdiction is binding, while decisions from other jurisdictions or lower courts are persuasive. The paralegal must then accurately brief the relevant case, extracting the facts, issue, rule, analysis, and conclusion, and present this information with proper case citations, as required by the NFPA Core Registered Paralegal (CRP) standards, which emphasize accuracy and adherence to legal citation conventions. This ensures the attorney receives reliable and actionable legal research. An incorrect approach would be to rely solely on the most recent case found without verifying its jurisdictional relevance or precedential value. This fails to adhere to the principle of stare decisis, as a recent case from an irrelevant jurisdiction or a lower court might not be binding. Another incorrect approach is to cite cases without confirming their accuracy or completeness, potentially leading to the use of outdated or misapplied law. Furthermore, presenting a brief that omits critical components like the issue or analysis, or uses incorrect citation formats, demonstrates a lack of diligence and understanding of fundamental legal research and writing standards expected of a CRP. Professional decision-making in similar situations requires a systematic process. First, clearly define the legal question at hand. Second, conduct thorough legal research, prioritizing primary sources within the governing jurisdiction. Third, critically evaluate the research findings, distinguishing between binding and persuasive authority. Fourth, accurately brief the relevant cases, ensuring all essential components are included and properly cited. Finally, present the synthesized information clearly and concisely to the supervising attorney, highlighting the precedential value and applicability of the identified authorities. Question 20. Compliance review shows that a client is alleging a series of actions by a former employer, including being cornered in a hallway and threatened with physical harm, followed by being forcibly escorted from the premises by security guards without explanation, and subsequently having false rumors spread about their professional competence to former colleagues. The client is experiencing significant anxiety and distress as a result. Which of the following best categorizes the potential intentional torts involved, requiring further investigation to establish specific intent and damages? Option A. Assault, battery, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Option B. False imprisonment, defamation, and harassment. Option C. Intentional infliction of emotional distress, battery, and slander. Option D. Assault, false imprisonment, and defamation. The correct answer is D. Assault, false imprisonment, and defamation. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a paralegal to distinguish between potentially overlapping intentional torts based on subtle factual distinctions and the specific intent of the alleged tortfeasor. Mischaracterizing the tort could lead to incorrect legal strategies, inadequate client advice, and potential malpractice claims. Careful judgment is required to accurately assess the elements of each tort and apply them to the given facts within the framework of U.S. law as it pertains to the NFPA Core Registered Paralegal exam. The correct approach involves meticulously analyzing the client's allegations to determine which specific intentional tort is most accurately pleaded. This requires understanding the distinct elements of assault, battery, false imprisonment, defamation, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. For instance, assault requires apprehension of imminent harmful or offensive contact. Battery requires actual harmful or offensive contact. False imprisonment requires confinement without lawful justification. Defamation requires a false statement of fact that harms reputation. And requires extreme and outrageous conduct causing severe emotional distress. The paralegal must then identify the factual basis for each element and the client's stated intent. An incorrect approach would be to broadly label the client's situation as a single tort without a detailed factual breakdown, such as simply calling it harassment without specifying the underlying tort. This fails to meet the exacting standards of pleading and proof required in tort law. Another incorrect approach would be to focus solely on the emotional distress experienced by the client without establishing the extreme and outrageous nature of the conduct or the specific intent behind it, thereby failing to meet the high bar for EAD. Similarly, assuming defamation without evidence of a false statement of fact communicated to a third party would be an error. Finally, conflating apprehension of contact with actual contact would lead to misidentifying assault as battery or vice versa. Professional decision-making in such situations requires a systematic process. First, thoroughly interview the client and gather all relevant facts. Second, research and understand the elements of each potential intentional tort under U.S. law. Third, apply the gathered facts to the elements of each tort, identifying which tort or torts are most strongly supported. Fourth, consult with the supervising attorney to discuss the analysis and proposed course of action, ensuring alignment with legal strategy and ethical obligations.